Hey AP Hug team, this is Sanchez back again with just a mini lecture to follow up from last week's reading on the core periphery model. Last week we received an article which I wanted you to T4 with the basic premise that countries around the world can be divided into two major world regions, the core versus the periphery. The core includes the major world powers and the countries that contain a lot of the money and the wealth of the planet, versus the periphery are those countries not reaping or not receiving the benefits of the global wealth and globalization. So obviously this theory, this model fits very nicely into our discussion of understanding economic development. Now in the actual model in this lecture, I want to go ahead and explore there's actually three levels in the Wallerstein model, which talks about a high development, which are the core countries. We also have a category referred to as the semi-periphery, which would be kind of in the medium scale. And then we have the low development countries, which are the periphery. Every country around the world, as far as our discussion of development, will fit somewhere to that equation. And obviously making connections to our different units, especially political in regards to colonialism or imperialism, when we looked around the world, and early industrialization. Both these are going to have a huge factor in terms of how we identify these countries, core periphery, and understanding that early industrialization definitely contributed to countries getting a jump start on that imperialism or colonial period. For example, we can reflect back to Great Britain. Great Britain was one of the first to industrialize, and it was definitely one of the first ones to be the most advanced as far as imperialism around the world. The phrase in British history, the sun never sets on the British Empire, for example. We know Great Britain gobbled up a ton of colonies around the world during the 1800s. All right, the first set of countries which have a high economic development, which would be referred to as our core countries. We've used the term many times, MDC, which is reference to more developed countries. So again, keep in mind that's another way of referring to them. And these core countries, as you read through your article, these are the ones that are really important as far as economically and culturally. These are the countries that, for example, have an extreme influence as far as pop culture. Their culture is going to spread around the world. These are the countries, we think of the United States, we think of Western Europe, Japan, South Korea is kind of moving up in the ranks. So a lot of these countries are referred to the core as far as their cultural and their economic development. Now the core countries we can also refer to as the assets of the global economy. Really, these are the countries that industrialized early on. So the fact that countries like these are the ones that actually feed the global economy, and they took advantage of it as well. If we think about, these are the countries that moved from farming to factories at an earlier rate. And then by that same token, we have factory work to, again, moving to more education, more specialized training. And now these core countries have moved into more of a service type economic system. Now, core countries are also recognized with a lot of innovation and creativity. And core countries are also, part of their development is the fact that we see they take advantage and exploit the poor, less developed countries. Now they can exploit or take advantage in multiple ways. One example we could look at is workers. We talked about in our population unit the concept of brain drain, where we see well-educated people from LDCs coming to MDCs to take advantage of the economic opportunity. So that could be one example. Of course, another simple example we could cite is resources. So environmental resources we can see, especially in our periphery countries. All right, so if we take a look at our world map, we can see in this particular case we have the three shadings. We have the core, which is in the orange, semi-periphery in the yellow, and periphery in the green. So again, going back to the core countries we can identify on the map, we see United States, we see Canada. Again, if we look up top, we can see Western Europe. Again, looking at France, Germany, Italy, Spain. One of the things to recognize, of course, that Portugal is featured in yellow, so would not be in that core category. So we can kind of see that this concept of development, these core countries, is very much a regional phenomenon. All right, our next medium level of development level of countries would be our semi-periphery category. These are kind of the middle of the road developing countries. Now, as far as we identify the semi-periphery, we can make a strong argument that most of Asia falls into this semi-periphery category. A lot of our Latin American countries. Eastern Europe is mostly classified in the semi-periphery. For a while it had been dipping into that core, especially under the Soviet Union, under communists during the Cold War period, but definitely has kind of fallen back into more that semi-periphery category. And also Saudi Arabia, which is kind of viewed as the center of the Middle East. So to clarify, the semi-periphery is benefiting from the core, benefiting from the economic development, but they're not driving things like the core. They're not at the forefront of leading the way, so to speak. As far as the semi-periphery goes, they're definitely shifting more towards a service space. They're definitely expanding or developing their urbanization, which is the rise of cities. But they definitely fall in that kind of middle of the road category. They exploit our periphery countries, but they definitely are still exploited. They're still taken advantage of and losing resources to the core. Their goal, of course, would be to advance and to move into a core category of development. All right, so if we take a look back at our map, we can see in this particular case the semi-periphery is featured in the yellow. So take a look around. We can see, again, looking at Latin America, we can identify Mexico, we can identify Brazil. We see China and India at this time still falls into the semi-periphery category. If we take a look for Africa, we can see South Africa falls into that factor. But interesting, if you look at the map, we can see that there's very large regions. We can see these are isolated sprinkles. There's definitely a chunk of landmass that falls into these different categories. Now, some connections that we can make as far as the semi-periphery countries. In the case of Russia, for example, up in the north, they had never been colonialized. We'd never had imperialism up there. So that's one factor. These countries have not been colonialized. Or number two, we can also see connections to where some of these countries left colonialism early. So for example, Mexico, independence from Spain early on. So for some of these cases, we can see that they had more time to develop if they weren't necessarily pulling from a colonial power for such a long time period. We can also see that education is a main factor towards the semi-periphery. That also includes development of their education, which is increasing their economic development. All right, the last set of low development countries we refer to as the periphery. So when we're saying poor, of course, we're looking at the LDC, which is our level of development. The periphery countries are not benefiting as quickly from globalization as we see in the core and the semi-periphery model. Again, the periphery are the ones that are being exploited by the other two categories. They're being exploited for resources, exploited as far as their workers and their economy. And some examples that we can see in terms of countries, the Middle East, we see parts of Southeast Asia, and we see most of Africa falls into the periphery category. So looking back at our map, we can see at the heart of this, a large chunk of the periphery falls into Africa. But again, look over towards the right side of the screen. We can also see Southeast Asia falls into this category of the periphery model. All right, another cool map to take a look at. You can see when we look from a different perspective as far as the globe, you can see in the center which will be our core categories, which again, if we kind of draw that red line in the screen, we see Western Europe, we see United States, we see Canada. Draw an additional circle, which will be our periphery or semi-periphery model, and then sort of in the outskirts, we fall in the periphery countries. All right, another graphic that I want you guys to take a look at, and we kind of mentioned throughout the lecture, we can see the core which is going to have high profit and consumption goods. Remember, they're the center of economic development. We see the red arrows are drawn to the semi-periphery and periphery countries. We can see semi-periphery is kind of in the center portion with the connection to the core and the periphery. And then, of course, the periphery, which would be on our right, which, again, a giant green arrow to the left, where we're talking about the core exploitation, in this case, cheap labor workers, as we said earlier, and resources and raw materials. At the bottom, again, we're talking about Wallerstein's World Systems Theory model, or the core periphery model. And this is a model that helps us understand the different locations of economic development. In an upcoming FRQ, you might also refer to it as Wallerstein's development model. All right, AP Hug team, now just kind of a brief overview of the core periphery model. Remember to finish reading and T4ing the article, which is titled "The Countries of the World Can Be Divided into the Core and Periphery." That goes a little more in depth in terms of the core periphery roots in colonialism and imperialism from our political unit, and also how that relates to different conflicts around the world. So make sure you take your notes from the video lecture, look over your article, and you'll be good to go. All right, I'll see you guys in class.